Oops. What is up? And welcome to the DynastyLeagueFootball.com YouTube channel. We're excited today. We got a very special guest. We are live and we are brought to you by DynastyLeagueFootball.com, better known as DLF. If you don't know who DLF is and you're playing Dynasty, you are doing it wrong. You need to get a premium subscription. Fix that immediately. Figure out what's going on in your life. And yeah, let's correct that. Speaking of great websites, though, we are joined by someone who is with footballguys.com. But first, I am your host, Cal Shoemake, and I am pumped to have Matt here. He's going to make the audience smarter. I'm excited that he's going to join us. He's the inventor and creator of the rookie scouting portfolio. He's a senior staff writer of footballguys.com. And he has emerged from his lab with 1,000 pages of amazing analysis that is so much more than just telling you about quarterbacks or running backs or wide receivers or tight ends. So much more. Matt, I'm excited to have you on. How are you doing today?
Cal, man, it's always a pleasure to get a chance to talk to you. And certainly I always enjoy the fact that I get to do some work affiliated with DLF. These guys are a great resource in the Dynasty community. And, you know, I'm a big fan of what you guys do. And this is going to be a fun evening for us to be able to talk about these guys.
Yeah, and honestly, so we're going to get into some of the 2021 rookies, of course. I feel like, we kind of have to do that. But I also want to talk a little bit about your process and maybe even some of the guys that are changing places right now. I think it'd be really important to talk about the scheme fit and, some of the distinctions that you make between whether it's the scheme or whether it's the talent or whether it's the combination. And I want to get into a little bit of that. But first, I got a really important question for you. So as I'm doing some analysis on you. I came across something really interesting. Who's the most famous person who was born on February 6th? Okay. Is it Babe Ruth? Is it Bob Marley? Is it Rick Astley, Ronald Reagan, Axl Rose, Matt Waldman, or me?
Oh, check you out. We're birthday brothers.
Yeah.
Well, see, we'll have to exclude us because we're just so famous. All right.
That's the only way to make it fair.
The only way to make it fair. I'm going to go with Bob Marley. I think Bob Marley, and I lived in Jamaica for a year. So it's, the impact he had on that country and all around the world in terms of what he brought. Music touches people's hearts more than politics and more than, so many other, and even more than sports, I think. So I'm going with him, even though Axl had a moment or two in the sun for sure.
He definitely did, but I like that. Bob Marley's a really good answer. Babe Ruth would be a good answer there too, obviously. But only one of those people 16 years ago decided that they were going to start writing up a book every summer on rookies. And it's 16 years old. I've heard you say it's got his driver's license now, and you've got a lot of experience at this now. But I want to spend a little bit of time on your process because I want people to understand you're not just a guy that decided you were going to watch some YouTube highlights and then jot down your thoughts about it. I really like what you say when you talk about showing your work and when you talk about your experience from corporate America. So what is it that you brought to the table 16 years ago, your background, your experience that helped you kind of uniquely set forth on this venture?
I think it can't be underestimated that I was a complete, absolute football nut. So to the point that I used to literally skip school in elementary school and plan my skip days by going to the library to get books about football players. And generally, which is kind of funny now when I think about it, a lot of them were running backs, usually complaining about running backs and quarterbacks. And, back from years before I was born, and I was born in 1970. So, but yeah, I would plan my skip days. I'd call, I was a latchkey kid. So I'd call my mother and say, I'm not feeling well. And then, go home and just read the book, read books. And I didn't do it often, but I'd say probably 3 or 4 times during my first, few years of elementary school after I learned how to read. But that was kind of my deal. I was obsessed with football. I loved football. And I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, where that was kind of down the road was the cradle of football, and so I ended up starting the RSP because I was in a profession where I had a career. I kind of fell into that career, and it was a decent paying job, and it supported the family, paid the mortgage, all of that. Seemed to be heading in a good direction, but I just was really unsatisfied with what I was doing. It was never the plan for me to do what I was doing, but I was an operations manager for a large call center. And then during the time when AOL was king, and they had just started out as like the big thing on the internet. And I came from a sales background and a customer service background. And I used to run like a 2,700 hour a week operation with about a team of, 12 to 15 supervisors and a couple of shift managers, and dealt with clients directly as well, which was a little unusual to be an operations manager doing that. And then we had like worked with AOL, and I'll just put it this way, is that AOL's call centers at that time had hired us, the client group, and they were trying to figure out how to retain customers. And we ended up kind of in direct competition with their operations group as an arm of their marketing group being hired. And their people got trained 120 hours before they ever set foot on the phone. Mine got trained 15 hours before they were set on the phone because that was what they'd allowed. So I had to develop processes to make sure that we were outselling them or out retaining customers while also doing it the right way and doing it with better quality. And we won. Mm-hmm. And so that was really I learned a lot from that, having to and create things like that in my like mid to late 20s. And then in my early 30s, I was made an associate director of a division where we looked at, production and quality a lot. And so that was over 70 different branches in this 10,000 employee company. And so I had to learn about databasing. I had to learn about employee performance and get credentialed in best practices and take some classes and pay a lot of money to get, the company had to pay a lot of money for me to do this stuff. And so as a result of that, I learned about these best practices, and I decided to apply that to football and evaluating football talent, because that process I knew would build on itself, because I could identify everything that I was looking at very clearly and define it and give it a proper weight and understand what those weights are, why those weights are important, and why that structure is important. And then as I continued to learn the game from evaluating thousands of hours of tape every day, that process built on itself to the point that I could figure out what I needed to learn more of, what books I needed to learn more of, who I needed to contact. And so by about 5 or 6 years into this, I started getting customers who were scouts. And I had a guy who was, I'll just put it this way. He had multiple years of experience as a scout. And then I had someone who had multiple years of experience doing analytics in the league at a high level, not for just quality coaches, but direct lines to GMs, and kind of said, listen, man, you're still learning as an evaluator, obviously, though it's not bad. It's just, I'm not going to compare you to a 30-year scout. And I'm like, I wouldn't expect that. He said, but your evaluation process is light years ahead of what I've seen in the NFL, and gave me scouting reports to look at. And the differences are stark. And it shows what I bring to the table is understanding that, as much as I'm a film evaluator and that's subjective, well, my process is to objectify the subjective as much as possible so that you're defining things so that you can get data out of it. And that's the difference, because, when if you don't define things clearly, you can go into a room and have, everyone who works in corporate America, you've got an evaluation where you've got like 1, 0 through 7 is the scoring format, and often many places. and no one gets a 0, no one gets a 7.
Right.
You know, very rarely do you get a 6 or a 5 unless you're about to get a promotion and the VP above your manager is actually going to do that, is going to sign off on that, and everyone's agreed. Mostly it's 3, 4, or 2. You know, and that's the NFL is very much like that. And he told one of the things that I was told by people was like, you're writing things that people are telling you that none of this is that what you're saying is ludicrous. You know, I would write about things and say, it's like corporate America. It's like these things. And they go, you don't know, this is crazy. And I would have people regularly telling me, I thought you worked in the league at one time because of the way you identified these situations, like you had a total bead on how it is, while everyone else is all in awe of the curtain that they lay down in front of it. So it gave me good encouragement at that time to realize that I should keep going with this and keep doing it. And it's gotten better and better to the point that instead of juggling 3 jobs, instead of it, Alex is a good friend of mine, and I saw him on another show recently.
Nice.
So I love it. But but you know, as a result of all that, I was able to continue to develop this, get help from people that could steer me in the right direction of things I needed to learn, and really get strong feedback. And I've had some fortunate hits on a lot of players that have kind of put me a little bit on alone from some folks. I've certainly had my big misses. You know, I think my latest big miss is Hakeem Butler. I think that's the one that most of the internet community likes to bring up to me. And it's like, yeah, so far it looks like nothing's going on with that. And I had him rated very highly. But those are things that you work through with it. And you know, I've really enjoyed the process of how that goes. And this is now a full-time job for me. And, you know, it's hard work, and it's something that I guess the best way I'd put it is that it's still a passion and it's hard work. But what I'm now trying to do is refine the process, though, so that it's not a job that I can do for the next 15, 20 years and still work hard, but be smart about how I do it and efficient. And I'm getting that process there. And this first year, this year's RSP is the first year where I can say I slept during April, and it's actually more content than ever before, but in a more efficient package.
I obviously your analysis of the players is really fascinating, but I'm one of the few people, I guess you mentioned a lot of people skipping over the introduction. Like, I love the introduction because, you know, watching film can be kind of a subjective thing at times. And I love that it kind of bothered you that it was subjective and you tried to turn everything into a yes or no question. What, like, in your brain, like what was that process like? Like, not just being able to say like talented, not talented, or he can do this, he can't do that, but turning it into those questions.
And that was part of the training I got, because it was like, when you evaluate something, you need to get a clear answer for what it is. And if you don't get if you can't get a clear answer, either you're not asking the right question or you don't understand what it is you're watching. And then you need to refine that question until it can be answered. You know, and so it's one of those deals where when you look at the situation, you know, I realized that I was learning more, because when I first looked at players, the RSP wasn't 1,000 pages long. It might have been 250, 300 pages. And it was just like 2 or 3 sentence blurbs and rankings and thoughts about where I was heading with this. And then it just kept growing as my knowledge grew. And my knowledge grew was because I was looking at this and going, well, why isn't he good as a pass catcher? What is he? Does this answer the question that he catches the ball well with his hands? Because sometimes he does. Sometimes he doesn't. And when you get to sometimes, then you start going, well, what am I not identifying? What are the times that are identifying that he is? And are there times that he's not? And then I start going, oh, well, when the ball's at his waist or lower, he's not using his hands correctly with waist high catches. And that may have taken me years to figure out, which was that I would realize after year 2, maybe it was like, I've got to differentiate between high targets and low targets. Now I've got to differentiate between how he uses his hands. And now I'm like reading receiver books from guys who coached the Indianapolis Colts and the recent wave of Oklahoma receivers, you know, back in the day, and reading about how you use hand position, how you get off the line of scrimmage, how you run routes, how you make breaks, so that all these things start to be separated out to the point that now, I mean, I used to have checklists in these that I would use to look at this stuff. And even that's evolved because it evolved from having one checklist. And then when I realized what I was doing was just like in a job interview, you could look at it and go, here's all the things that this candidate can do. And then you realize you're like, that's great. He can do 85% of what I'm asking this person to possibly do in this role. But really, how often are they going to do all 85% of these 100 things that I'm going to ask them to do? And I'm thinking probably 40% of the time, 80%, 60% of the time, they're going to be doing these 20 things. And then if they're really good at like 10 of those 20 things, they may not even have to do some of these other things because these great talents they have are keeping these other things from happening, or I can supplement them with somebody else for a lot less money and get a lot more money out of this person because of what they're doing in this area. And that you've just basically described DK Metcalf, maybe, who's great at a number of things, but you're not asking him to be Sterling Shepard. And so who is good at a lot of stuff, but at the same time, he's not great at any one thing. And you'd be happy to have him play flanker if you need him. You could have him play special teams or be a returner or a gunner if you needed him to. You could put him in the slot, easily. But is he the greatest at any one of those things? Absolutely not. He's a capable starter. So which one's more valuable to you? It depends on your team probably, but most people would probably say DK Metcalf based on what they've seen. And that's probably right. So I had to learn the difference between breadth of talent and depth of talent, how to score that, how to define that, how to structure it so that I'm asking the right questions, and how to have value from both so that I could differentiate to people and say, listen, this guy's rated a little below this guy because really they're both equally very talented in these areas and can really have big impacts, but this one can do it in more areas. But that doesn't mean, so they're in the same tier, but like at the same time, if this team drafts the guy who's rated lower and puts him in this system, he has more upside than the guy who has a little bit more depth of talent, because of the way that all works. So there's still subjective stuff there, but you want to be able to pinpoint all these small details so that you can explain the subjective part of it. And then you can track information in a way so that when I say something like, you've got to, as a running back, you've got to be able to deal with indirect contact or at least direct contact with the linebacker and stalemate them, where it's like if they hit head on, that at least the running back doesn't lose any ground. He doesn't get knocked backwards. They stay like this, and either somebody's going to push them one way or the other with the scrum that goes on from there. Well, I've seen, after studying 700 or how many running backs over those years that I made the statement, that there were only 2 running backs who didn't score that on my checklist as getting a stalemate, who actually started in the league and had like reasonable fantasy production, and one of them was Marlon Mack. So somebody would say, well, you're not a stats guy because all you do is watch film. And I'm like, nah, I'm actually tracking that stuff. Like, the thing is, Dwayne McFarland, who worked with me, who's at PFF and who is an analytics guy and is a big time, high stakes tourney winner. He's been an RSP subscriber for years and came to me and wanted to work with me. And because he knew I had this database, he's a healthcare analytics professional. And he was like, I know you have all this rich source of data, and like you actionably try to use it, even though you're not advertising yourself on this range of what you do. And so that's the thing. I'm like total film watcher, but I started fantasy football looking at numbers. That's all I knew. And then I was like, I got to learn about watching film because that's how the numbers are generated. I've got to know football. And I always loved football, but that's where I really started to learn football, was by taking an analytical approach to become a better film watcher.
There's a lot more to you, just maybe similar to a crow. There's a lot more to a crow than you expect, a lot more to Matt Waldman than you expect. And I want to ask you just a little bit of a follow-up on that, because I love what you're saying about can he catch a football or can he not catch a football? And that right there is way too simplistic of a question for you. And somebody might even know enough to say like, oh, he's a hands catcher or he's a body catcher. But like, once you start peeling back the layers, I remember, and I think a lot of the listeners probably, work in corporate America or have, and maybe you attended a class or you attended somewhere, a workshop that was telling you like, I remember I was in one and it was like, write down the steps to making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And like 20 people in the class had 20 different answers because nobody fully understands what it is to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I love that you were watching film and that was like, I've got to explain this, but I've got to explain it like not just on a surface level. I got to explain it all the way through in depth.
Yes, because that's an even better example of what I've always used, because I would write down, how would you have an administrative assistant answer the phone for you? And it's like, you could gather 20 managers in a room or see different people who've dealt with having administrative assistants or been administrative assistants at one time in their careers. And you ask them, what do you want him to say or her to say? And you're going to get different answers. They might be close. And the NFL does the same thing, because when you have a 0 to 9 grading scale, that's the advantage I had. If you say it's an advantage, is that they do that. And everyone I talked to along the years, Matt Williamson, who does great work, he and Ryan McDowell, and with Dynasty Blueprint. Listen, Matt Williamson, I remember asking him, he was a buyer of the RSP before I met him. And he was like a scout with the Cleveland Browns. And I said, how'd you get that job? And he's like, I had to take a test and watch film. How'd you do? Well, I got the job. So they didn't tell you. No, I just got the job. So I did well enough. Cool. Did they give you any kind of like continuous training? Do they train everybody on how they want you to watch who the guys are? No, they just expect you to know. And if you don't, you ask people and help. And they told you if you need to get clear, you can go to position meetings if you had time, because you're working 80, 90, 100 hours a week. So as a result of that, you realize why things happen where younger scouts are like, well, I'm not sure about this guy. I like him more than I think everybody else in the room does. So I'm probably going to give him a 4th round grade. And then the other guys are like, well, I dislike this guy more than everybody else, but everyone else is really high on him. So I'm going to give him a 4th round grade rather than an undraftable grade. And it's just like giving the 3 on the evaluation, and it's like, that kind of thing can happen. And once you've worked in that environment for any length of time and you see the NFL and the way they talk and the way things happen, you start to realize they're no different than anybody else. They put their pants on the same way as everybody else. And it's just like and at that point, you kind of, there's oddball stories. And I started hearing more and more crazy stories, just like crazy businesses that crazy things happen. There's outlier stories. But generally, this is the kind of thing that goes on, and you have to realize that because they're fallible in this way, that you don't want to get too much in awe of what the process is. And so for me, it's like when I started breaking this stuff down, people would tell me it's like that's worthwhile, and the results would happen that way because I'd watch players, and I didn't have time to just watch college football like I used to. I mean, the way I watched college football before I started the RSP, it was Saturday afternoon after a work week. I'd have some pretzels in one arm. My cat would be in the other arm, crooked up asleep next to me. And then I'd be asleep and wake up and realize that Steven Jackson had 120 yards for Oregon State in the 3rd quarter against Colorado. And my notepad that I had that I thought I was going to use was like empty because I ended up napping, and it's like, that's how I watch college football just as a fan, Right. And so it was like a different deal. But when I started to, but when you start to actually break things down and do this, I remember, I didn't follow any narratives because I didn't have time. I was like trying to study so many players and so many games. And I'd have guys that I would rate in my top 5, and nobody had him rated in their top 5. No one had him drafted. He didn't even get. Remember the first guy that was assigned for me was a guy by the name of Mike Bell, who was a running back for the Denver Broncos.
And Rolling Saints.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
And Mike Bell I had is like, I think my 5th or 6th running back on the board, and he didn't even get drafted. And I thought, oh, shows how much I know. I mean, I'm just starting this thing. I got a TiVo and started taping stuff, and here we go. This is crazy. And then next thing you know, he's the starter by the end of training camp. And I was like, okay, I probably got lucky there, but let's see. And then just kept kind of building like that, where you'd start to realize, I don't like this Darren McFadden kid or this Matt Liner kid. I actually like this guy better. And people would say, what do you know? You never played the game, or all these types of things. And it's just true. And it's understandable but at the same time, what you realize is that if you put enough hours into something and you study it systematically, and you figured out something to learn how to learn, and you're dedicated to it, anyone could do what I did from the level if they wanted to put the work into it. And so when I first met my wife, she would, she's 10 times smarter than I am. So when she would look at what I was doing to a degree. She didn't know, she never looked at the product, but I would tell her what I did. She'd go, aren't you afraid of like people like taking what you're doing? I think you're giving away too much, or you show all your work. And I said, no, don't worry about it. And she'd look at me, and we'd have like debates about it. We have good debates. They're never like bad arguments. So we argue a lot, and we were debating about it. And I said, listen, come upstairs, come take a look at my office, look at what I do. So I showed her. And do you understand now that if someone wants to copy what I do and they do it successfully, I'm going to congratulate them and want to meet with them and hang out and talk shop with them. Right. I'm not worried about whether or not I'm going to lose customers, because no one's going to copy what I do unless they have the same kind of crazy and the same kind of perseverance to get a customer base to do it. And she was like, yeah, I get it. And I'm like, that's exactly it. So when I do a show like today with Rick Saratella of Draft Bible, he's a competitor because we're competing for the same eyeballs. But seriously, I know what that dude had to do. I met his wife for the first time for all of 30 seconds, and I knew how she was just like mine and how invested they were in like being either a strategic part or even a hands-on part of trying to help out on some level in their extra time. And you got to admire that. I mean, you just got to look at that and go, and people buy multiple products. So that's the other thing. So it's like, I'm not sitting here going, oh no, Dane Brugler renamed his thing The Beast, and I'm going to have to make some cartoon of like the RSP and it's like glory dropping down on the beast and a bird carrying it off. I think it's funny, like the idea of doing something like that. But I love Dane, and I love the work that he does, and he does in a different way, and he covers all the players. I just cover 5. So, or 4, really. I can't even keep count anymore. So it's like, but that's the point. So it's like, this is a fascinating community in that respect.
It really is. And I'm glad you mentioned Ryan McDowell of Dynasty League Football. And it's a good opportunity to mention, if you're watching this, like they do have now, we have the DLF Dynasty Guide, for 2021 that's out. And it doesn't have the extensiveness for your rookies, but it does have Dynasty League Football overall. So everything from where to have your league and, all those things, like a lot of great tips. And being a premium DLF subscriber allows you to download that for free. So definitely, if you're listening, check that out. It's worth it right there just to be able to do that. But I want to transition a little bit, because there's what you see on film, and then there's what the person can become. And I like your stance on this, but how do you evaluate when you're looking at somebody in college, or where they are as an 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old to what they can become as a 24, 25, 26-year-old? How do you take their potential into account?
That's probably the most difficult thing, because what you're having to account for is what they might develop athletically. And you have to that's kind of a craft to kind of figure out in terms of their body type, in terms of what their position is or what their position could be. You could be a slot guy who might be able to fill out more and be an outside guy. Or you might be a tight end who might be able to lose a little weight and become a receiver, or vice versa. Or a quarterback who could fill in and become a tight end, Logan Thomas, so you've got, or running backs, Eric Metcalf, becomes a wide receiver. All of that can interchange. But then you're also looking at things like, what are the easier skills to learn? What are the more difficult skills to learn? And to me, what I've figured out is that for my scoring, at least, I have bonuses. I have like bonuses to the score. So like if a player can say, for instance, perform good hand releases at the line of scrimmage against press coverage or good footwork releases, they're going to get a certain number of points. And it might be tiered by the number of releases they can execute effectively against defenders based on how I score to a standard of what the NFL would expect, not what they can do in college. And then what I'm also looking at is what's their capacity to possibly get better at this? Do they show quick feet? Do they have the short area quickness to be able to perform these tasks? Do they, is the effort there? Do they have some of these skills, at least showing at least clean technique with one of these things or two of these things, and showing that they can learn it and then have the capacity to learn more? If they do that, I give them a bonus saying that they can improve. But it's like halfway between the grade that I gave them and the next tier. Now, it's very possible then that there's a player that like DK Metcalf, if he learns how to release with his hands, with those violent hands that he has, and with that big size and speed, he could be very unstoppable one-on-one on outside routes. And maybe he, we'll say hypothetically he wasn't doing that at Ole Miss. Then at that point, I could say it's reasonable he should improve, but because he's so strong and fast and big, I got to give him more upside than that. He has real upside. So then I'll give him another tier, which effectively puts him in the next tier in terms of points, but he's still listed in the tier below, which kind of gives you an idea that, that he has a chance to move at least up a tier. He could probably move up 2 tiers, but I don't do that because I feel like that's too much of a projection. You risk over projecting the player. So there's times that I will tell people, listen, I think he could probably, even though I've given him this, projection, he could be even higher than that if he does what he's supposed to do. I just don't feel comfortable doing that because I'd rather be conservative and say, you've got to prove to me more of that than what's going on there.
All right, now it's time to take a trip down Narrative Street. I've heard your buddy Sigmund Bloom talk about Narrative Street before, so I'm going to take you a little bit down Narrative Street. And this is just a few things that are kind of popular on Twitter that people like to say and seem to be kind of taken and just assumed to be 100% true. And I want to get your reaction to it, okay? So, number one, immobile pocket quarterbacks are going extinct.
That's false. That's absolutely false. Immobile pocket quarterbacks are not the fad. Immobile pocket quarterbacks are harder to find and develop and have always been harder to find and develop. Mobile quarterbacks who can get outside and throw on the move are more desirable because they're high-end athletes and they fit the systems that we're seeing that are infiltrating the NFL. But at the end of the day, even those quarterbacks, even Russell Wilson, who plays a lot outside the pocket and may even generate his own volition to try and do that more often than maybe at least according to some Seahawks contingents of fans want to say, they all have to win from the pocket. In order to break the pocket, you still have to see the field and feel the pressure and understand when and how to maneuver to best make an efficient decision. And the pocket is never going away. It's not. If it goes away, we're probably having flag football at that point. So you have to be able to navigate the pocket by, dropping back efficiently, knowing where your blockers are going to set up and where they tend to set up, having a feel for pressure pre-snap, post-snap by diagnosing all of that. And you still have to know how to move efficiently. Baker Mayfield was mobile. Baker Mayfield didn't always know how to move efficiently to climb the pocket. This is why Baker Mayfield will roll outside unnecessarily on a lot of plays, But while Russell Wilson, you'll see him move efficiently in the pocket oftentimes in ways, or Drew Brees, who could, back in his day, could move through a thicket of 300-pound people and get that ball out and take a hit and still be able to get down. And he could roll out in the pocket. He was mobile enough. He wasn't Deshaun Watson, but again, there's not many Deshaun Watsons, even though we think that they're all over the place now. So Tom Brady wins from the pocket. Patrick Mahomes, maybe the best quarterback that has come out since Tom Brady. And may be the best quarterback. He may turn out to be the best quarterback who's ever played, at least at this current point. He's certainly making an argument for it. He lost big in the Super Bowl, and his opponent's wide receiving core was on the bench, losing their mind at how brilliant he was. But what he was doing so brilliantly was missing throws that were coming this close to making under duress because there was no pocket for him to be able to throw from. And he was moving around and does all those things on the move. So you could say, well, you can get in the playoffs without a pocket. Russell Wilson's done that. That's fine. Deshaun Watson's done that. But can you win the big game? Because that's what supposedly makes you, that's the whole point. Can you go to conference championships and win conference championships and go to the Super Bowl and win them? And the answer right now is we've seen the recent Super Bowl winners, and most of them are guys who can win from the pocket. Jimmy Garoppolo was a pocket quarterback, but he couldn't win from the pocket. He freezes up in the pocket, turtles in the pocket more often than he should. He has moments where he's fantastic, but he's not consistent with it. And as a result, they're looking for another quarterback now. So that's how I see it.
All right, second narrative street. The NFL Combine doesn't matter.
Oh, it absolutely matters. Because you need, as much as people look at, say, it's data versus film, it's really about how you use data to complement the film. Because as any good analytics person that I've ever talked to would say, and the most public one I would say who is in that tier is Chase Stewart, who writes at Football Perspective, his own site, will tell you is that good analytics is a reflection of what you see in process on a football field. And if it isn't that, then you probably aren't approaching it correctly. It's got to be a reflection of that. So when you look at the Combine, sometimes the way people apply the data really doesn't matter. You can look at Dalvin Cook, and the way people applied Dalvin Cook's data didn't matter because they were saying he wasn't quick enough, he wasn't explosive enough, he doesn't have the short area agility that he should have. And what you realize is if you watched the film and watched his game, is that the way he played didn't have a reflection of the way he played at a high level. He wasn't a jump cutting, hard cutting back. He was a curvy linear movement back, a back who moved at a high rate of speed along a curve around defenders while trying to stay downhill as much as possible. What measures that in the Combine? Nothing. We don't have curvy linear movement, run the arc and see, and see how fast he can get around that arc at full speed. We don't have anything like that. So because of that, you have to realize it's like, well, if he's not jump cutting, he's not making hard cuts, but he's moving around people like this, some of these skills don't really apply all that much. Is he fast enough? Yeah. Does he have enough burst? Yeah. So what you're seeing is someone who anticipates information and who has solutions that are outside what the data would show to say that it matches it. And with some backs, it matches very well, but you have to learn what matches the data, or what data matches what the player does. And if it doesn't match it, then you can say, that doesn't make sense to me. Like Quintez Cephas last year, he ran a slow 40, and it's like, and everybody was like, oh no. But then you watch the film, and it's like he's getting separation against cornerbacks on a regular basis, and you realize it's like he didn't know how to start. He didn't get taught to the test. It's just like, it's just like the poor kid in an underfunded public school who doesn't get SAT lessons, doesn't get Kaplan tutoring, doesn't have after school high-end programs, isn't in classrooms where where only one or two kids get detention for acting out, but really there's only one or two kids that actually work out. Like my daughter, when she first moved, we first moved to an area where the school system was awful, the public school system. She came from a great school system and went to a poor one in her junior year. The teachers literally sent her to the library because she was the only kid in the class who they knew was actually going to pay attention, and that it wasn't like just getting them to stay behaved and do what they need to do minimum. And she spent like 3/4 of her junior and senior year in the library learning, which was ridiculous. So that's part of the issue, is that the contextual part of all of this isn't always perfect. And so it's getting better, and they can give you approximations of what's going on. But you have to understand that, like a guy like Cephas, he wasn't taught to the test, and he didn't know how to start. And then 2 weeks later, he ran a better time in his pro day. And you could argue that maybe the grass was cut tighter, and that maybe it's a more elastic surface, and maybe that helped a little bit here and there. But you also could see from his other timings that there were other explosive elements to his game that showed that time was off, and further added to that. So there's a lot of interpretation that people want to put into templates and kind of just box in, and there's no craft to that. And as a result of that, when they lack that craft, they're out there making pronouncements saying, Ezekiel Elliott's the worst first round pick ever, because we must follow this box rule of what running backs and rounds should be, or they're just trying to make a point. Most of them are trying to just make a point, but it's those types of things that happen that go down where, they start making grand pronouncements. Guys who are 6'2" and 210, if you're not that, you can't be a good wide receiver in the league. We had that go down for a number of years ago. And, Odell Beckham Jr. reminded people once again that probably was a fallacy.
Yeah, you don't have to be Calvin Johnson. You can be Steve Smith.
Yeah.
Right?
Or Henry Ellard or Deshaun Jackson or Marvin Harrison, all those guys. And it doesn't mean that doesn't have value, but you don't cancel everybody, because this is something that you look at that and go, what are the compensatory factors for the player that make them better or worse because they're shorter or lighter? Can they make up for it in some other way? If they don't, then you're like, okay, maybe he's not quite good enough. Or you look at it and go, oh yeah, he plays like he's 6'3", 220. Then we're good.
So let's go ahead and get into some of these 2021 rookies, because I know anybody listening certainly wants your opinion on those. So let's talk about ideal landing spots. Now we know where some of the top ones at the top of the draft are going to go. What about Trey Lance? Where do you think would be the right place for him to end up?
Minnesota, to be honest, but we know that's probably not going to happen. But I'd love to have him sit behind Cousins for about a year or half a year. I'd also wish he was in Cleveland, but that's my own fandom there. So as a result of that, it's going to either be Atlanta or San Francisco, it looks like. And I'd say Atlanta would be the great spot for giving him a little more time to develop and working behind a player who's going to be all class and Matt Ryan, who will be a good mentor to him. And so then when you look at that, and then you have Matt Schaub, who might be also still be around. So you have two real veterans who can be mentors to him, and he can function in that system very well and have high-end receiving talent. But what he does well right away, right now, if he needed to start, San Francisco would be a very good match because of the wide zone system. He's played in a pro system before, at North Dakota State, made all those checks, great pocket, or great drop back game, great play action game. He can run. So you get a lot of added element with him where you can do design roles, and he could be in an offense where the run is so good and the offensive line is good enough that he could help out now and not completely falter, and maybe start halfway through the year if they keep Garoppolo as a bridge guy right now. But for me, with Matt Ryan in Atlanta, you could play a little more spread. You can still do some outside zone, but with spread and him spreading the field and being able to run like that is really nice element too. And having the experienced quarterback, to me, that's important because development is very tough in the league for that. I'd rather him be in Atlanta because of that experience and the kind of player he is. He's not the kind of player that is probably going to give Trey Lance the cold shoulder, even though he knows he's losing his job to him eventually.
Yeah, not necessarily a Ben Roethlisberger scenario. Let's not do that to Trey Lance. What about he's not known for his mobility, but as we said, as long as he can navigate the pocket, that's what we want. What about Mac Jones? I mean, rumored, obviously, a lot of strong ties there to San Francisco, but would that be the best fit for him, or is there maybe another fit that you think would be better?
I'd like to see him in New England because I think because the way I like to look at quarterbacks, and I first started talking about it with Eric Stoner back in the day, who was a Roto World writer and wrote with me for a while, and it was task oriented or creative player. And the better way to put it is the way that Mark Schofield updated it at my site, which was baker or chef. If you're a chef, you're a little more improvised. You can make adjustments on the fly as to the recipe to make it taste differently or better. And if things go wrong, you can usually, within some reason, be able to correct it and still make it a good dish. Whereas with baking, everything has to be precise. So the high-end bakers make it look like they're creative chefs, even as precise and exact as they have to be with everything. Tom Brady is the example of a guy who makes everything look effortless. But as I joked on recently with someone, he's the guy that while the baker, they say the temperature on the oven has to be at 400, but it's at 401, and it might ruin most other bakers. You would say, well, he knows, he's so prepared that he knows that. I remember back in 2004, I put a drip pan in the oven, and it kind of cooled things off just by like a degree, and that allowed me to do this in this way. You remember when we did that, Bill? That's like Tom Brady's personality, and he's that high functioning one. A mid-range functioning guy is Kirk Cousins. Some years he looks great when everything's together. Some years or some games he looks awful. It's usually game to game or week to week with him. Sometimes quarter to quarter. But that's an average to below average version. Marcus Mariota has proved to be a below average guy where it looks like the lights shut off in the middle of the play sometimes, where he freezes or doesn't know what to do in the pocket. Mac Jones is somewhere between Cousins and Brady. I think he's a mile or two away from Brady, but I think he's a good football field or two ahead of Cousins in terms of potential. And if you put him in an Erhard Perkins offense, he can handle all the different possibilities with Josh McDaniel and Bill Belichick, who've worked with that kind of quarterback style and personality. They have the template in Tom Brady, and Mac Jones has shown he can handle that kind of thing. Put them together and you get the ideal situation in a year or two.
So what would be the right situation then? Let's switch over to running backs. How about Javonte Williams?
I think he'd be good in Pittsburgh because you run a little bit of gap, you run a little bit of zone. He's kind of an all-around guy. He's a lot of like a Mark Ingram type of player. He's tough. He can catch. He can run physically. He knows how to use his pads. He's just fast enough. So you're getting a slight upgrade to James Conner when James Conner was at his best. So I like that fit.
A guy that I know you like a lot. How about Trey Sermon?
Oh man. I like to see Trey Sermon in Atlanta. Because again, you get a back who he could work under Mike Davis or pair with Mike Davis for a year. They can clean out the guys who are behind them that I think everyone's hoping in the dynasty community something happens with, Smith and Ito Smith, but I don't think that train's going anywhere. And then Brian Hill, that train's already left. Mike Davis is a very good back in the NFL, and certainly we saw what he could do when he got the touches. But I think that Trey Sermon is a very smart back, and he can run inside, outside. He can be a good pass receiver, even though he didn't get the touches. The quality of touches he had were good, and he's a promising pass protector. So I think Atlanta paired with a guy like Trey Lance for them together, and then having Calvin Ridley would be a great setup for him, though I think there's a lot of places he could go.
What was your take when you watched film on Kadarius Toney? I know he's a bit of a polarizing prospect. What was your thoughts?
I like him. I think there's a couple concerns with him, mostly on the field, but he tracks the ball well. He's obviously dynamic in the open field. He's a lot like Golden Tate to me. And I think that you think of Golden Tate with the Lions, 90 catches plus for a few years at 1,100 yards. and 5 to 7 touchdowns. That's not bad, especially in PPR leagues. I mean, you're going to get a quality wide receiver too in a PPR league out of that. Maybe some years, if everything goes right, he could be a wide receiver 1 on the low end with that. And he's a guy that can play a little bit on the outside like Tate. He has better ball handling skills in terms of how he goes up to catch the football with the technique that he has. Golden Tate is actually the exception that proves the rule in terms of his hand usage. He's one of those guys that can body catch and take contact and still come down with it. And there's only 2 guys I've seen in 16 years that really do that well. There's 3 that made it in the league, but here's the 3, okay, that I remember right off the bat. Golden Tate is by far at the top end of the spectrum. In the middle of that spectrum is Early Doucette, who had kind of a mid-range career, but he could do it, but he wasn't a great player. And then you had the guy who was more productive than Early Doucette, but he was drafted in the 2nd round. That was Ted Ginn, who he dropped like multiple balls, but if he caught one, he was a game changer. You could win DFS. You could win money in DFS playing with him, in the right week. And because he was so low cost and he had such a high range of outcome, that you could get, if he caught 2 passes for touchdowns, odds are you got 2 catches. You probably had like a three catch, 163 yard, 2 touchdown day out of him. And you're in the money because nobody else even thought about him. But those were the 3. So the big problems with him, he plays a little bit outside his frame as when he runs. So he slips as a route runner. He slips as a runner after the catch, and he has to kind of control that gait a little bit more because he can also put himself at risk for injury if he takes hits or makes some awkward landing. And enough times where you're playing outside your frame and balance like that, it's kind of odds are more in the favor that it could happen.
I want to ask you a little bit about Rashad Bateman as well. I mean, I know obviously he's somebody that it seems like the NFL likes Kadarius Toney more than Bateman, the way that the mock drafts look. But the fantasy community likes Rashad Bateman a lot better. So, like, what do you think when you look at these two? Like, do they like Kadarius Toney more because he can contribute on special teams and more in that area, or why do you think there's a contrast between those 2 things?
I think this comes down to that whole concept of what the business world does. When you're interviewing 2 candidates, and you're going to hire the 2 it's down to 2 candidates. Now you're at the point where you're like, these 2 guys both can be good, but it's not always who can be better, though that's what you'd like to say. I think Rashad Bateman can be better because he can play slot, he can play outside. And he can do both in a way. And he's not as good of a runner as Toney, but he's pretty high up there. He's not that far away, but he's a better route runner. I think he's a better pass catcher. The difference is that when you start to think, who are we going to draft in the 1st round, or who are we going to draft early in the 2nd round, and how are people going to react to that? Well, you start thinking, what's our case? What are we going to tell the media? What are we going to tell our fans when we draft this guy? Who went to the more celebrated program? Who had more production maybe every year? Who had the better combine or pro day? And then if they're close, then the questions are, who stayed the healthiest? What's going on off the field? Do we have any major question marks about this guy's production? Was it consistent at least? And when you look at Rashad Bateman got COVID. And he lost a ton of weight, and then he opted out and then decided to come back and play at a suboptimal weight for himself in an offense that they used him differently, and he wasn't as productive. Though you look at moments on tape and you're like, that same guy still in there. But like Mike Davis, who we just talked about, there was good Mike Davis, junior Mike Davis, and senior Mike Davis. Junior Mike Davis was like a raging rhino running through the SEC, and senior Mike Davis might as well have been like a rhino on tranquilizers, in comparison. So you look at Rashad Bateman, and that's the deal. So I think from a mock draft standpoint, big media or NFL people are thinking, who's the safer looking pick at this point? And the better resume goes to Toney, even if the better player is more likely to be Rashad Bateman.
When you said that about Mike Davis, that made me think of Chuba Hubbard what like he's a guy that had similar situation. How did you take that into account when you studied him?
Yeah, I mean, like for me, because I'm not a draft guy, while I account for the stuff when I explain it and we're having the conversation, like it doesn't matter to me. I don't even look at production when I look at players. I literally just look at what they do on the field. And while I understand that there are some potential links to production because of usage, but if I see enough usage in a guy, that you look at Hubbard, the thing with me is that he has a limited type of runs that he uses in that offense. They run a lot of lead draw, which is you're not going to see a lot of that in the NFL, except in one or two situations in drives, basically 3rd and long, 2nd and long, or on 2-minute situations where, yeah, of course, you could put Peyton Barber in lead draw and he's going to gain yards for you, even if he doesn't have Chuba Hubbard speed. The other thing is like toss and gap plays. So he'd be great in a system like Indianapolis, but they already have 2 backs now, or at least one and another one coming back. And I'd argue that Jordan Wilkins is a pretty fine reserve in terms of what he has to offer. So now you're looking at San Francisco, or a team like the Jets, where he's very much like a Tevin Coleman or Raheem Mostert type of prospect anyway. I think he's closer to Tevin Coleman, who could grow into Raheem Mostert in terms of the physicality of his play. But he has some issues there. And I think when you just look at his game, he got more mature, even though he didn't go off on everybody, this year compared to last year. But he was a more mature decision maker. And what I try to look at when I isolate players is about the questions also are designed to ask, what did the player do within his own range of ability to set himself up for a positive outcome? Doesn't mean he had a positive outcome, but that he set himself up so that a positive outcome could happen if he got the help that he needed. And I learned that very early on from players like Ahmad Bradshaw, Mike Bell, and Matt Forte was a great example of that. Joseph Adai was a great example of that. Yeah. I mean, I tell the story a lot, but Matt Forte getting over basically, having 1.9 yards per carry against LSU, watching the game and being like, this is a terrific back, even though he averaged 1.9 yards per carry against a defense that basically they had one offensive lineman at Tulane who could outlift a handful of players on the team, on LSU, just a handful on the team. Literally, there were reserves who outlifted every player on Tulane's team except for one offensive lineman. And that's who met. And this was a national championship caliber LSU team that he played. And he still, what he did under his own control, it was very clear that he set himself up for positive plays over and over and over again, even though there were negative outcomes.
He was special. He went to high school just down the street from me, so he was fun to watch. Yeah. So how are we doing on time? I know you got a bunch of these lined up. You got
no more. You're the last one tonight, so let's do it.
Okay, because I want to ask you a little bit about like a couple more prospects, and then I've got some of the NFL guys that I want to ask you about that I know you studied too. But another prospect that I'm really interested in here is Terrace Marshall. I don't see a lot of talk about him, but he seems to jump off the page to me. So what did you see when you saw Terrace Marshall?
I saw a versatile receiver who can be a big play threat or a high catch player. Just depends on how you want to use them. And I think all 3 of these LSU receivers that we've seen come out in the past 2 years are very good. And you're not going to be disappointed with any of them unless you expect Terrace Marshall to be better than the other 2. And I'd say he might have better production, might land somewhere where that happens. But if that's your bar, it's too high of a bar. But if your bar is like, I could get an 800 yard to 1,200 yard receiver, that's a wide range. Let's say 900 to 1,100 yards. And in his peak, where maybe he gives you 2 or 3 years of that before you start worrying about contract, injury, fit, and all of that. I think he's capable of that during his first 4 to 5 years. Like he'll give you at least 3 years of that. and maybe the shot at close to double-digit touchdowns if he's in the right system, because he can play inside, outside. He runs decent routes. He's tough. He's mentally tough, that when he makes a mistake, he seems to be able to recover pretty quickly. He's been on a big stage in terms of playing under pressure and playing at a really high level. Now, he had great players around him, but at the same time, even last year, he didn't have great players around him last year, compared to this past year as compared to the year before, and he still played very well. So he's I think he's my number 6 receiver on the board. And to me, that means he's, from the grade I gave him, I believe I have him as a contributor who, Terrace, that's a great suggestion.
That is.
Yeah. I would definitely say that Marshall to the Titans would be a terrific fit for him, because I think he could be an upgrade to what Corey Davis was earlier than what Corey Davis did.
This is a good question for Mike here. The mental toughness part of the game. Did you notice any wide receivers that stuck out that you were like, yeah, that's mental toughness is a big part of his game?
That's a great question, and I'm glad Mike asked that. I got to think about that for a minute. Let's look at some of the top players. I just got to look at names to kind of remind me. I would say Bateman was definitely there, because what impressed me so much in his game repeatedly is that he has a real knack for running that dig route and the over route, where he's working inside the hash, oftentimes against tight man coverage, and then catching the ball and seeing the flash of the safety or linebacker either dropping into his window of purview or coming downhill and coming at him as he's making the catch. And not only did he have the concentration to complete the act of the catch, but he also had the wherewithal to be able to make a step as he was doing it that was able to point his toe or hip in a way that next step after that catch, he made that defender miss. But he could also take contact. So to me, that shows someone who is very refined in their ability to do this. And I remember seeing him against Georgia Southern, against guys like Kendall Vildor, who's playing with the Bears right now. And I don't remember the other guy's name. I think Martavius Brown. I don't remember Marquavius Brown, I think his name is. But these two guys may not be well-known cornerbacks in the NFL at this point. But they shut down Clemson's receiving core 2 years ago. I mean, shut them down man to man. Got multiple interceptions in that game early, not like late when they were getting blown out, but like early, and made a game of it. And he handled those guys and did pretty darn good. And Georgia Southern is maybe not be like a hotbed of like NFL talent, but they are a hotbed regionally of NFL caliber athletes, guys who can hit, guys who can run. That's why you look at a guy like Matt Breida, and he's if he could stay healthy, Matt Breida is an incredible type of runner. And then Jerick McKinnon was a heck of an athlete. Those guys both came out of Georgia Southern, and that's kind of and those two cornerbacks were pretty darn good to hold their own against Higgins and Williams and Justin Ross and Amari Rogers. And I don't even know if Powell even got in the game at that point, but that gives you an idea.
Yeah. So I looked a little bit into Amon St. Brown, and the only thing I know for sure is that his family needs a 10-part Netflix series so we can get to know them a lot better and learn. I don't know if you looked into the family very much, but the dad, 2-time Mr. Universe. I mean, the mom only speaks to the children in German. They took their SATs in German and French and English. All the kids, they only eat red meat for breakfast and dinner. Fascinating family. What do you think about Amon the prospect?
I think he's basically a guy who, at the worst, is Sterling Shepard. At the very worst, I think he's kind of like at that Mason Dixon line of, these are guys that are going to be NFL players, and these are guys that you think have potential to be NFL players, but you have some doubts about whether they're going to be starters. I think Amon-Ra St. Brown is a guy who will probably be a starter, but his low end is like Sterling Shepard, which is not all that exciting. Everyone's waiting for something to happen because you admired what he did, but he never quite takes that next step because of either the surrounding talent or his own skill limitations as a player. but he has a little more upside than that. So I think he has a little more upside. Maybe he's more like, the other Steve Smith, who was with the New York Giants back in the day, who before the bad knee injury had showed enough burst to be able to get downfield off play action and be a big play threat in the middle of the field too, and play some outside. And I think he's a lot like that combination of players.
You just reminded me of Hakeem Nicks, and I just got sad that we didn't get to see the full Hakeem Nicks. Gosh. Okay, I'm gonna ask you about NFL players and in new situations, and spend as much or little time on this as you want. But Sam Darnold teaming up there with Joe Brady and the Carolina Panthers. What do you think of that fit?
I'm happy for Sam Darnold because obviously I think the talent was enough there for him to develop into a starting quarterback of decent value. I mean, I think that anyone who's like Sam Darnold or Baker Mayfield, and you really want to make it an either or situation, I'm more of a both. Like they're both could be competent starters in the league, meaning that with the better the team, the more likely they could become a Pro Bowl producer in terms of stats. Now, I think Sam Darnold had a little more in his game to be able to do off-script work and carry a team more often than Mayfield, who it looked like he could do that, but I always felt like that it wasn't quite there. The problem, though, is that lots of quarterbacks get ruined in the NFL based on the fact that they don't have a great development plan early, and it wrecks their confidence or it wrecks their ability to see the field because now they're worried about things and get into bad habits that are hard to get out of.
Seeing ghosts,
exactly. If you have to me, with quarterbacks getting hit, it's like putting your hand in a windowsill with the window open and someone slamming it on your hand enough times that you're now, if you even like think about putting your hand on that sill, your hands are going to tremble and shake, and you're not even going to be able to put your hand on the sill. And, if he's at that stage, it doesn't matter what, who he's with, but if he's a guy that was never really at that stage, and I think I don't think he was, because when he says I'm seeing ghosts, to me, part of that was bad, but it wasn't, to me, Derek Carr, who's the guy that everyone talks about who saw ghosts, he was like the guy who saw ghosts and then was left in the basically left in the haunted house with Annabelle, for like about 3 years, and they locked the door, and it was like that was him. Sam Darnold's more like, I see the ghost, and they're like, you're gonna have to stay here for a night. Yeah. And they left him there for a night. I think that's really more likely what happened with him. So I'm more optimistic that this might work out, though the burden of proof is on him. But if you're you're going to play the odds, well, the odds are against him. But if you're like, I think if you were one to have nuance about the odds, you could say, I'll take a chance on him at the right spot.
Kind of similar situation, I guess, than when you look at Carson Wentz going over to Indianapolis. Obviously, joined back up with his offensive coordinator there. But what do you think about, is that getting into that scheme fit that worked for him? Have defenses caught up, or do you expect him to be able to kind of hit the ground running where he left off?
I think that as long as his offensive line is good enough for him to do what he did in Philadelphia in year 2, then we can see a situation where he could be pretty good. Like pretty good meaning, low end of the top 12 for fantasy football, which is good enough, or top 15, and he's a streamer for you, has some really good weeks. So I think that can happen. Now, if the offensive line doesn't play well, forget it, because as we've seen, he needs that to be the Carson Wentz that we saw, because that was his problem before the scheme fit. The Eagles, they got this guy, West Coast offensive quarterback who performed all these drops. But when you look at his tape from those back in the day, the issue was his drops never ended with good footwork. His follow through was never good. His deep accuracy, it was like you never knew what you were going to get from one throw to the next. He was too long, too short, too outside, too inside. He never had a good barometer for that accuracy beyond 40 yards, and would say, well, he had the most completions one year of over 40 yards. Yeah, because he was running around with his head cut off, and then guys would drift behind the coverage, and you could just throw it to somebody like you were, an outfielder. And these weren't pinpoint throws. You could look at accuracy stats and say all you want that he was accurate, but if you were actually charting the way scouts chart, and you're looking at is an accurate pass isn't whether it's caught or not. An accurate pass is whether it's in the spot that it should be in for the receiver to make the catch. That's how I chart. I don't chart whether I mark drops, but to me, it's accurate if it's where it's supposed to be, and then I tier it by whether it's where it's supposed to be, exactly the way like the route is run, where the coverage is on the defender, and how that quarterback should anticipate where the ball should be placed. That's accurate, whatever the receiver does. Then there's general accuracy for me, which is, is it catchable? And catchable enough that you would say if he dropped it, you'd say it was his fault for dropping it, even if it was a tougher catch. Now, to me, and then I would say a difficult catch is one where you say, I wouldn't mark this dude off for dropping that ball, but he caught it anyway. And that, to me, if you can say that honestly, that's a difficult catch. So for me, with Wentz, he always had general accuracy, and that's the deal with him, is that you look at this and you realize that with the Eagles, they found out by game 3, game 4 in the second season that he couldn't do this stuff. Hey, Matt, it's okay, but they needed to use pistol and shotgun, short drops, throws within 20 to 35 yards that he could throw without great footwork, and he can get rid of the ball fast. And if he couldn't get rid of the ball fast, the line was good enough that he could scramble around and buy enough time that somebody could drift behind the safeties. Then it didn't matter how accurate he threw the ball because nobody was there other than the receiver. So with Wentz leaving, that leaves a hole in Philadelphia that it appears Jalen Hurts is going to be the guy to step into that. Nick Sirianni is in town. What do you think about that fit? I think, it's going to be a test for Wentz. I mean, excuse me, not for Wentz, but for Hurts. Hurts is a guy that you realize that he has some good deep ball accuracy. He's better than Wentz in that respect. He can hold on to the ball too long, and the longer he holds on to the ball, the more he thinks he has to stay invested in the play. So he has to figure out that it's okay to check down or get rid of the ball faster. If he does that, that's good. If not, then you're going to see the fumble machine pick up in the way that he was at Oklahoma. And then that could be really problematic. But I think that if Wentz can do what he did a few years ago, I think Jalen Hurts has a fighting shot to be able to get within range where you go, he's a respectable starter this past year. But I'm anticipating some obstacles he's going to have to overcome when defenses say, all right, we know these are his weaknesses. We've seen enough tape. Now let's install some things and not play kind of straight up the way we do, because teams don't use adjustments with new players because they don't want to over analyze what they did. They want to see what these guys can or can't do. And then once they get enough tape on them, that's when they start to make these adjustments. And I think they'll do that. And you'll see a bit of a slump, and then you'll have to see if he can overcome it. And if he does, 2023 might look bright for him. If it doesn't, then yeah, we're looking at somebody new probably in 2023. Last question, Tua, optimistic about what he's going to be able to do in Miami? Yes, I absolutely am, because you have to remember that he really didn't. The plan for Miami, they said it in the beginning of the season, before the beginning of the season, we're going to let him sit, and then maybe halfway through the season, we're going to use him. And so they stuck to the plan. But then they realized somewhere during the line, oh, we're contenders. And the players were like, what are you doing? Ryan Fitzpatrick's good. He's helping us. Why are you benching him? We can go to the playoffs. Why aren't we competing this way? And I think the team got caught in this mode of, we got to develop our franchise starter, and they're mad about this, and he's going to make mistakes, even though he had moments where he played really well. He had some good games. and then but you're realizing that you feel like you're sacrificing your present that you didn't expect to have. And so I think that's part of it. But there's much made about this, especially because Deshaun Watson became available for a period of time before what's happened, and so as a result of that, I think people were now making the comparison. Would you rather have Tua or Deshaun Watson? And as good as Tua was as a prospect, it's not a fair answer because we know that quarterbacks have a high failure rate, and we don't know what they're going to be like because everyone thought there were so many people who thought Mitchell Trubisky was like the best quarterback of that Mahomes-Watson class, Mayfield class, and Mayfield might have been the next Brett Favre. But now we're looking at it and it's like, it's nothing like that. And while there's some people holding out for hope, I guess, but you look at that and it changes very quickly in a year. And so when Tua wasn't immediately a stud, now they're like, Sean Watson, yeah, this Tua kid, he can't lead. He wasn't all that good. The narrative is suddenly like this overreactive thing. I think he's going to be just fine.
So if we ask 20 people how to download the Matt Waldman RSP, we might get 20 different answers on how to exactly describe how to do it. But how would you say, tell the people how they can download your RSP, like over 1,000 pages. It really is good. Don't skip the introduction. Make sure you read that, understand the process. It's really, really, really interesting to me. But also, can you comment a little bit on, I know that part of that is charitable. Can you tell the audience a little bit about that?
Sure. You can download the RSP at mattwaldman.com. That's just the sales page site right now. And there's two products there. One is a full dynasty rankings and dynasty projections. That's a separate product, and we can talk about that another time. You can read about that. But the book itself is the $21.95 product. You'll get to select that. And basically you pay via PayPal. You'll be creating a download and a login when you do so. And then it'll redirect you back to the page. You'll have to sign in with that login that you created, and then it'll download in PDF form. And if for some reason you have an issue with that, you email me at mattwaldmanrsp@gmail.com. And within 24 hours, I get back to people, and usually a lot sooner than that, and we get the matter resolved. It doesn't happen very often. And then in terms of the thing about the RSP is that one of the things that I've done since I think 2011, 2012 is I give back to a charity known as Darkness to Light. They're an organization devoted to preventing sexual abuse of children or addressing it when it happens in a way so that it doesn't compound the trauma. And they do this through training of adults. They train adults about how to recognize potential signs of sexual abuse, the dynamics of sexual abuse, what abusers are like, the data behind the phenomenon of this so that people understand how not to compound it, so that, that they believe the victim, that they know how to handle the situation better. And they do this by training communities who are, whether it's government organizations, universities, public schools, civic groups, individuals. Anyone can go through the training, essentially. Ali Rossman, the gymnast who, was in the news recently over, the sexual abuse that she dealt with. She has been a spokesperson for this organization. And this month is Child Abuse Prevention Month. April is. And I was fortunate enough this year to be able to give $4,000 to them right off the bat. And so I usually cap it at $5,000 now. I was doing it 10% per sale. I do 10% per sale up to $5,000, and then I cap it there just because otherwise I might not be able to continue to invest in the infrastructure of the RSP to continue doing this. I'd rather cap it so that I know I can keep giving for years as opposed to, go overboard. So for the detriment of the business that I have. But I think, they're very grateful for the work that we've been able to do as readers of the RSP who have bought the book and have allowed me to contribute this in the name of the RSP. If you want to check out how they are in terms of Charity Navigator, which is a really great resource, independent resource for evaluating charities, they are at a 100 out of 100. And I know that they've improved that under their leadership since I first started. They were more like I think a 75 or an 80, which was still pretty good. But they've really stepped up in recent years to make this a first-class charitable organization in terms of how it's run like a business so that they can maximize what they do.
Seriously, this is a great comment here from Joe. That was awesome. And really, Matt, I love that you care about that. I love that you could contribute to that. And thank you for doing so. And I love that your work even is helping people understand more than just like, can a guy catch a ball or not? But you want people to understand the game. And ultimately that leads to enjoying the game. And you're not playing dynasty football if you don't enjoy the game or not a fan of the sport. And you started off with that, and I love it. Shows through everything that you say how much you love the game. And for any of those in the audience that are listening, if you love the game, make sure you check that out. Amazing work. Check out everything that Matt's doing. He's got his Twitter account back at Matt Waldman, so make sure you check that out.
Yeah.
And also check out Dynasty League Football. We have a lot of great things there. Dynasty League Football is just such an incredible resource, so many great tools, collecting a lot of data behind the scenes, and a premium subscription is absolutely worth getting. Also, if you're watching this, make sure you are subscribed to the channel, Dynasty League Football right here. Get notifications so you make sure that you don't miss interviews like this, and follow DL Football on Twitter. Follow me at Calvin and Hobby. So for Matt, for everybody there at DLF, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.